Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mike Hamilton's panel speech here. Grid doing big things. I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of network security and mining. So Mike is going to change that for us. He is the Chief Research Officer of Grid, a company made to procure low-cost, carbon-free energy to build, manage, and operate a growing portfolio of vertically integrated Bitcoin mining facilities. Mike is responsible for Grid's technical and operational success. Previously, he was the CEO of a cloud-based cybersecurity platform. Makes sense. Mike?
All right, thank you. How you guys doing? So I get the pleasure of making your eyes roll back in your head with boredom on network security. Obviously, I used to run a endpoint security company, so security is near and dear. Early on in my career, I was an ASIC designer for the first decade of my career, and then ended up taking that, moving over into the network and security test area on the hardware side. Of course, with the ASIC panel happening at the exact same time, which I would also be interested in seeing. Thank you guys for coming to hang out with me, because if it were my choice, I would be in there with those guys. Given that it's a fairly small crowd, feel free to interrupt me, ask questions as we go through. I sort of had this whole thing in mind as more of a big stand on a stage, but with the more intimate environment, it actually is a little more conducive to actually helping you guys answer questions and helping me. I mean, there's a slide here in a second on sort of what our goals, what my goal for this session and this time together is to have a couple of you guys walk out of here. If one person walks out of here with one little tip or trick that they can go home and actually implement either in their single S19 setup at home or in their multi-megawatt farm, hopefully you can take just a couple of tricks, one that you could do now, and maybe even one or two that you might do for your next build, for your next setup. So that's really what what my goal is for today. And hopefully you walk out of here not feeling like this is a complete waste of time and wishing that you had been at the ASIC panel, like I do. Not that I think this is a waste of time. Obviously, I think it's a very important topic, of course. So sort of just a quick outline of what I'm sort of going to cover. Go through a quick networking 101, sort of on sort of the raw network layer. I'll try to go pretty quickly through that. Again, feel free to interrupt me, stop, ask questions. Things work a whole lot better when I'm answering questions because it's something that someone actually wants to know as opposed to what I think you guys might want to know. And then one of the most useful things for me earlier in my career was understanding how when you plug in something into network port, how does that device go from being powered off to actually being able to communicate and actually talk on the network. So I'm going to sort of walk through what that looks like. Again, networking is all sorts of different layers and angles to it. So there'll be some details that are probably omitted and things like that. So we'll go through a couple of making the network work for you, some tips and tricks that we've sort of discovered as we've built our facilities on things that can make things a little easier, some common mistakes, and then some security best practices. I've got a sort of a discussion on a couple of examples. One of the questions that I'd gotten before someone asked me to cover was sort of how can someone actually get into your network and actually steal your hash rate. So I'll go through a couple of examples on how that potentially happens, and then, of course, some Q&A. So start sort of with the networking 101. So the entire concept of networking, you may have heard of like the 7-layer OSI model of the different layers. You've got your physical connection, and you have all these different software layers on top. Practically speaking, it really sort of gets broken down into a more simplified sort of 4-layer model. So your physical layer, that's of course your copper, your wireless, fiber. So that's the actual physical interconnection between sort of two devices. For the next layer up, called the data link layer, it's really your Ethernet. It's where you see MAC addresses. If you see MAC addresses, it's a pretty popular way for identifying miners in networks. And then you've got the network layer, which I think most people are familiar with. You've got IP addresses, IP. So we'll dive a little bit more into that here in a second. I've got an example of an actual packet capture to sort of walk through the different layers. You can sort of see how it actually plays out. Next up is the session layer. So the primary two session layer protocols are TCP UDP, there's a few others. SCTP is used heavily in 4G, 5G mobile. TCP is sort of your reliable transport protocol. And again, we'll see some more of that. I'll sort of walk through some of those specifics in the packet capture here in a second. And then you sort of have UDP, which is your sort of raw packet. There's no reliability built in, and any sort of protocol that needs reliability but is built on UDP, all of that reliability has to be built in at the next layer, which is the application layer. And you may be wondering, where the hell is 5 and 6 in this 7-layer model? And this is sort of I think they call this sort of the simplified DoD network model. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7, and I can't even remember what 5 and 6 are. I think there's a presentation layer and some other one, I don't remember. Doesn't really matter. But the application layer is where most of you guys are probably living. You got your HTTP, your DNS, your Stratum protocol for us miners. Quick show of hands. How many in here are actual, or people actually mining? Okay, great. That was the target audience, so that's good. Yeah, the application layer, obviously super important. DNS sits on top of, as an example, DNS sits on top of UDP, which of course sits on IP, either 4 or 6. Although practically speaking, DNS also has DNS6 because IPv6 has its own set of complications. But so this is the effective sort of network stack. And again, I'm not trying to teach full networking 101. This is sort of just a quick primer. I actually intended to do like a little YouTube session, whiteboard, more of a deep dive on it, but ultimately life gets in the way. And even getting these slides done was a miracle. All right. So anyway, I'll just constantly ask for any questions on any of this. Anything that's like, hey, you're totally wrong, you're a total idiot, or yes, you're a genius, because I've never seen that before, which you probably have, because you could probably find that exact same diagram on Wikipedia, the Bible of information. All right, so hopefully the animations work. I think I spent more time on this slide than the rest of the presentation altogether, so bear with me here. But ultimately, what I've always found to be useful is understanding, like I said earlier, actually understanding all the steps of the process of actually plugging in a miner to the point that can actually talk to your mining pool and actually start making use some of that sweet BTC. So you've got your miner over here on the left. You have sort of my representation of a sort of a dumb layer 2 switch. You've got your sort of core router here in the middle. You got a firewall. You have all your ISP, and then you have your mining pool sort of out. So that's sort of the representation of what's happening here. So assuming we were all powered up, we're all physically connected, you plug in that Ethernet cord into your S19 here, you establish link. I was gonna make a little green light pop up, but ultimately it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, okay, time to go to bed. All right, so generally speaking, and I'm talking this is really from a DHCP perspective. I've got strong opinions on static IPs. I got into a Twitter spat last week about it, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So effectively, when you plug in this machine, it has no concept, unless you're someone who uses static IPs, of where it lives, what it is, how it's supposed to talk to everybody else. So DHCP, technically it's a layer 7 protocol, but effectively what happens is a broadcast packet gets sent out, and that broadcast is what I would call a layer 2 broadcast packet. And so that means that MAC addresses, again, I'm jumping all around, so stop me if I'm confusing you guys. So it sends this DHCP request. It doesn't know who it's supposed to talk to, and it basically broadcasts out the network and says, hey, I'm here, I need an IP address, and I need some more information, which we'll get into in a second. And so depending on how your network is set up, it could ultimately be, if you're more of a home miner, it could be your sort of your router gateway, NAT gateway, which I would argue it's a NAT gateway less than a router, but separate discussion. So for argument's sake, I'm going to say it's my firewall that's actually acting as my DHCP server. You may have your own DHCP server sitting on a Raspberry Pi or a server, but ultimately it needs to know, how am I going to talk to the network? So I need an IP address. I need to know what network I'm on. I need to know what my gateway is, and the gateway is effectively in a IP network. So most people here are probably familiar with, you buy your router from Best Buy, wherever you get it. You get a 192.168.0.1 address. You go punch that in, and that's how you log into your router. And typically it's a /24 network, which means there's effectively 8 bits at the end. So you get 255, 256 minus broadcast, a couple of others. So call it 254 or so IP addresses you can actually use. But it needs to know where to send. If it's trying to talk to another network, it needs to know how to get out to the internet. And that's sort of the default gateway. Then you got your DNS servers, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later. NTP oftentimes is, your NTP servers are oftentimes allocated over DHCP. Sometimes they just default to whatever the ntp.org. And then your time to live. Time to live, and there's a whole bunch of other DHCP options that are out there, but these are sort of the basic ones. TTL I find to be an important one, especially in large-scale networks. I prefer short TTLs, which is a time to live. So once it gets its response back, it knows all of its information. It's effectively how long it can use that information before it needs to go out and request request a refresh. So we'll get into some advantages in a second on why that is. So now my miner, which assuming I've already configured it for its pools, now it's got to go figure out which 0% fee pool you're going to use for today until they jack up the fees and you move to the next 0% fee pool. Sorry, apparently the 0% fee race to the bottom joke didn't go so well. So basically it goes off and does a DNS query. Now, I have it shown here going to sort of the ISP DNS servers, but most of the time it's actually cached inside. So your little home Linksys, D-Link, whatever home router is actually proxying, or not proxying, it's actually caching, and it's actually serving as its own DNS server. But for argument's sake, 8.8.8.8 is Google DNS, or we'll talk some more later on DNS. And then you get the response, which is going to be the IP address. So once the machine makes the DNS query and gets its IP, it has actually no idea that it's actually talking to your 0%feepool.com. The machine is actually only talking to that IP. And we'll get into some of that later on, but that becomes important from a security perspective. So now the machine has effectively everything it needs to know to go actually talk to your mining pool. It knows, hey, here's my IP, so I know how to talk to everybody else on my network, although we'll get into that also in a second. It knows where to send its local packets to be able to get out to the internet. And now it knows what outside host it is actually talking to. So once that happens, the first step, as you remember, you had your physical layer, your Ethernet. You have your layer 2, which is sort of the local MAC address, which is sort of happening there in the DHCP. Then you're at the application layer, which actually, because I alluded to it earlier, DNS actually sits on top of UDP, so there's some layer 4 in there as well. And now your layer 4 connection, which is TCP for the purpose of Stratum, Stratum v1, and effectively it opens a port to this 52.25, IP. It opens that TCP connection, and I just picked those are some of the random ports that some of the pools use for Stratum. Now, why they use 443 or 25, which is HTTPS and SMTP respectively, is actually super painful from a security perspective, but that's a separate question. So then the TCP response, and again, I didn't go into super detailed, but TCP, there's actually a 3-way handshake to establish the connection. And then once that connection's open, now our miner and our pool are able to talk at that application layer, in this case, Stratum. So there's effectively a couple of handshake, and we're actually going to dive deeper into Stratum a little bit later on. And then the Stratum server says, okay, let's party, let's go make some money. And then effectively you get some work, and then you submit some shares, and you accrue your Bitcoin. So this is sort of that step-by-step process for how your machine, your miner, goes from no IP, no configuration, from the network perspective, and how that kernel gets the IP information it needs to talk, and then all the way down to how you're actually submitting shares to your pool. All right, I know that was a lot, so I'll pause here for a second. Are there any questions? Anything anyone wants to dive in further, or we can keep on going? Fantastic question, which I think I might actually be getting to next. So the answer is, which you'll see. Sorry, there's one last one there. Great question. Let me hold off on that for 1 second because I actually have some pictures. I've got an actual diagram on that, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But fantastic question because it's not always a simple answer. That's also I have the number 1 rule coming up, but the number 2 rule of networking is the answer is always it depends. So, for what it's worth. All right, so what we're looking at here is, in fact, so this is actually a packet capture collected off my Raspberry Pi, which is actually man middling for the purpose of a separate discussion. But just want to sort of dive into this for a second, because I'm assuming many people don't necessarily understand networking to the level they've actually pulled up Wireshark and actually done a capture and actually looked at the actual packets and how they actually show up on the wire. So we talked about sort of the network stack, and again, the physical layer is sort of removed from the purpose of from Wireshark, because it doesn't matter if it's wireless or Ethernet or otherwise. So physical Ethernet. So you see up at the top, you've got Ethernet, you've got the source, and then you've got the destination. So those are the actual MAC addresses. Now, MAC addresses typically are allocated by IANA to different manufacturers. And so in this case, Wireshark happens to know that it's a Raspberry Pi physical MAC address, and then whatever random MAC address that the miner has assigned itself. So that sort of is the layer 2 information. And the reason why I highlighted the TCP is you can see this is the actual bits that are actually being transmitted on the wire. And if you actually look at the hex decode, you can actually see the IP address. There's a 4E BC of the Raspberry Pi here. And so you can actually see there's some header information. There's the actual physical addresses. There's some trailing information. And then sort of it moves on to the next layer in the stack. So even though it's sort of visualized as a stack, it's literally just a bit stream that have various delineations within the headers so that people know, I say people, the machines know where to start extracting information and moving on to the next, passing on the next layer in the stack. So next you have TCP. You can see the source port 3333, which is a pretty common Stratum port. Typically, the initiator of the connection, in this case the miner, typically they use random high ports, which is why you see this 59832. Kernels usually establish or usually issue, technically that's a source port because this is actually a response from, is this the response? Yes, this is the response back from Stratum. So anyways, so a couple things to note on TCP. You've got the sequence number concept. You can see sequence number 1, and then sequence number raw on the backside. So effectively, in TCP, a sequence number is a byte for byte number that lets you know how many bytes have been sent in a packet. In this case, this is a single Stratum. This is the response from the Stratum server, but obviously information can be sent in different sizes. And so in order to actually be a reliable protocol, which TCP is, you need to actually be able to track byte for byte what bytes have been sent. And then there's an acknowledgement from both sides. And TCP is bidirectional, so both parties can send and receive. And so that's the concept of the sequence number, and the acknowledgement number is for each direction. Here's the bytes that I'm acknowledging I have received and confirmed. And if they haven't, then the sender knows to then resend that information later on. So then you move on next. You can see the actual JSON blob, this data section, which is effectively just the Stratum protocol here. And looks like it's saying that it supports version rolling, and it looks like it's got this mask to let you know which versions in the Bitcoin header are actually supported to roll for ASIC Boost. So whatever pool I'm using here, I actually don't remember which one does in fact support overt ASIC Boost, which is a whole separate discussion. I have lots of separate discussions apparently as I'm talking. All right, so here we go. First rule of networking: there are no right answers. There are wrong answers, but there aren't necessarily any right answers. I guess I'll just jump in here. So sort of getting back to the question on, if you need, more than 255 or 254 IPs in a subnet, the way I sort of think about it is /24 is sometimes, /24 is sort of your home network size. Those can be useful depending on, ultimately the size. The size doesn't matter. It does, but it doesn't. It's more about using a consistent and repeatable network physical layout. So, for example, for argument's sake, we've got a mine that has a building or several buildings. Within each of the buildings, you have a group of racks, and then within the racks, you have a different set of shelves. And the absolute best practice you can do from a physical, how you're actually plugging, miners to switches, switches to the next switch to the router to the firewall, is an extremely consistent plug configuration. So if it's the bottom shelf in rack 1, then miner 1 through 12 in that rack should be plugged in through ports 1 through 12. That switch, which is shelf 1, should be plugged into your top of rack switch in port 1. And so by having that extremely consistent naming convention or physical convention, it allows you to come up with a naming scheme based on the actual physical location. Now there's some way more advanced stuff that you can do with SNMP and LLDP to actually dynamically map your network, which we have a couple of our sites where I wrote some super cool automation that can actually detect, we go move a machine from one rack to a different building, and a different rack will actually follow and detect that it's been moved. And so there's lots of really cool things you can do there, which is a little more advanced than for what we're talking about today. But developing that naming and location scheme and applying that not just to the physical racks, also the IP space, also the host name space. So I would highly recommend people name their machines from a host name perspective based on that naming scheme. Use that same naming scheme for your worker names, because I see a lot of people that they use the static IPs to show where the actual machines are. So, for argument's sake, this is building 1, shelf 1, miner 1 would be something like 10.1.1.1. So that's great, except for the point when you have to take that machine and you move it to a different rack because this PDU died. How many of you here have had a PDU die? And temporarily, you got to go grab 10 machines, 12 machines, however many are on that PDU, and go move them to a different spot where a different miner died. And now, if you have a static IP, you have to reset it. You have to go change the IP on your laptop. You got to plug in physically, directly, which is why I'm super against static IPs for that purpose, because it just causes so many more problems. We'll get to this in a second. If you have to use static IPs and you don't want to use the naming convention, then for the love of God, use DHCP reservations instead of static IPs, such that when you move that miner to a different one, a different pod, different building, different rack, or bring it into your workshop to go do repair, it can actually pick up an IP in whatever local setup you've got. Don't use static IPs. I hate static IPs. Use short DHCP leases. I alluded to that earlier. A lot of times we have a situation where a shelf switch, the top of rack switch might die, and I might have some extra ports here. And while I'm figuring out how to switch that, it's easy to grab 7 Ethernet cables off of these switches and plug them in here. Now, because these miners never lost link, they're still going to be on their old IP space. And if this is on a different VLAN, which I highly recommend using VLANs and very small subnets. And the reason for that we'll get to on the security side here in a second. But short DHCP leases will then prevent you from having to go back and then power cycle all these machines to pull a new IP in this different subnet, which is why I prefer short DHCP leases. And typically, the reason for longer DHCP leases is just the amount of broadcast chatter on the network that can get congestion. But miners ultimately use so little bandwidth to actually mine. I mean, there's a reason why most miners come with 10100 Ethernet plugs. They don't actually have 10 gigabit Ethernet jacks on them because it's more expensive, and there's really no good reason. I mean, you can look at a 10,000 S9 site will be using less than 5 megabits of aggregate traffic at any given time. It's just so light from a bandwidth perspective. Again, if you use IP for location, use reservations instead, and size VLANs and subnets appropriately, which it's a great question, and it depends, but it's probably a better conversation to have offline. I prefer something in the /24 space, the sort of that 255, which tends to work out pretty well considering that's about the number of machines in a sort of a 1 megawatt sort of chunk. All right, common mistakes using static IPs. If I haven't said it once or 5 times, then I'm going to say it 6 times. Another common mistake is even if you take a network and you change it to a larger subnet, maybe make it a /24, which is 254 usable IPs, and maybe you make it a /22. Oftentimes, the DHCP server actually has its own sort of restricted range to what you can actually allocate IPs. And so that's a common mistake where you have 500 machines in a subnet, but you only have allowed the DHCP server to issue 250 IPs. So that's a common one. Honestly, the biggest mistake not maybe the biggest mistake, but making subnets too large, that can also be a problem. Some of our early network designs were all /16s because I was lazy, and it was easier to set up. It is absolutely worth taking the time to make smaller segmented VLANs and smaller subnets, and I'm using them interchangeably. They're not really interchangeable. They are different, but effectively, I almost always use a subnet that aligns with the VLAN. So if you make them too large, you can run into problems where it's harder to slice them up. It's worth spending the extra time up front to actually do the proper segmentation there. So
it's a good rule of thumb to have so let's say you have, for just generalization, like 100 miners or something, and then you want 3 IPs for backup pools per miner. So what kind of what kind of network setup would generalize? Or is that a rule of thumb like that? Or?
yeah, I mean, I think so. The nice thing about using what I'm calling a /24, that sort of 254, is it breaks on the 3rd octet boundary. So I wouldn't go any smaller than a /24 because then it gets wonky when you're doing binary math on the upper bits of the lowest octet. So /24s are pretty safe because even if you're only using 10 IPs out of a /24, there's effectively 2 to the 24 /24s. There's actually not because there's private IP space, but there's plenty of /24s to use. So that's a pretty good best practice is to stick with /24s. You start to get have more in a subnet, then you get weird math on the IP on that second or that 3rd octet, which gets a little funky. In terms of backup IPs on the pools, yes, you should absolutely use at least 2 different pools, and in case one goes down. So generally, we use our primary pool for the first 2 with 2 different ports, and then a backup pool in case the primary pool is completely down.
Does your company Grid help build this out for miners that are scaling? Or?
No, so Grid, we're a self-mining. We just have our own portfolio of sites that we own and operate. This is just my weird security passion from previous lives, and was hoping to help other folks. All right, so some best practices. The easy ones. Don't leave your default passwords. There's lots of malware out there that does, in fact, will go check root. It will go check admin. It will go check blank password, if you can even do that. All the same, different password is good. Site specific, if you have multiple sites, is better. And completely unique is best. Practically speaking, nobody actually does that. But it would be the best. If you're buying used miners, put them in an isolated network to reflash and configure. Don't plug them in. I've been on a couple of phone calls and Zoom meetings with random Telegram folks that were having problems that I tried to help that did not do that. And viruses, in this case, there's AntBleed, there's a couple of others. They do, in fact, want to go and they will talk to the other machines and they will infect them, which is why better passwords is always a good thing. Unless you absolutely need it, leave SSH disabled, mainly because from an attacker perspective, it's way easier to automate SSH access than actually trying to automate HTTP direct access. To be fair, miner UIs are fairly simplistic, so it's still not that hard. But leave it disabled unless you have a reason. For remote access, anyone ever here ever put a miner on a DMZ or did a port forwarding to be able to get to it when they were at work and it's at home? Well, don't do that. That's bad practice. Find a home router if you're at home, or use sort of enterprise firewalls for. There's OpenSSL. There's a million ways to do it, because if you leave one open and they can get access to that machine, then that machine is now their pivot point, and they can get to every other machine in your network if they can pop that machine. And it's not terribly difficult. All right, some harder ones. Enforce outbound whitelisting. So whitelisting is, I think, in my opinion, the most effective security tool in the arsenal. And effectively what outbound whitelisting is you can say, do not let any traffic from my network go outside of the network unless I've explicitly allowed these IPs. I will say it's a complete and total pain in the ass to implement and use. And actually, I'm gonna open source something here in the next couple weeks to make some of that easier. But if you look at all the different mining pools, they're almost all hosted in either AWS, Ali Cloud, or I don't know that I've seen any specific that I can remember in Azure. But and so a lot of times the IPs are changing constantly. A lot of times things that miners are using are connected in through content delivery networks. IPs are always changing, so it is complicated and can be a pain, but it is absolutely the most effective approach to minimize your security surface. If your machine, you get one machine that's compromised and it can't talk to its command and control servers to tell it what to do, it makes things a whole lot more difficult for the attacker. Auditing miner-side hash rate against pool-side hash rate. So there's various tools out there that you can go and actually see the machine-reported hash rate. Pools are obviously, maybe it's not obvious, they're trying to derive hash rate based on the shares you're submitting, but there's a physical hash rate from the machine, and if you can actually audit those against each other, that's a pretty successful way in at least identifying that there's a problem. It doesn't solve a problem if there is, but it at least helps you identify problems that you might need. Port isolation. A miner has no reason to ever talk to any other miner in your network, ever. There is literally no reason. So port isolation, there's a couple other names for it depending on your network vendor, VLAN isolation, private VLANs. Which effectively allow the machine to talk upstream to router, switch, gateway, but don't allow two machines to talk to each other. If you have implemented port isolation, then you don't actually have to worry about your miner worm problem because it can't actually talk to any of the other miners. So that's a technique that a lot of layer 3 smart switches do support. Using DNS servers you explicitly trust. Obviously is a better thing than just sort of, hey, whatever AT&T or whomever is serving me up. Using what you explicitly trust, whether or not that's Google DNS, VeriSign has a DNS servers, OpenDNS, which is now owned by Cisco, another useful DNS tool. So I think I'm actually running out of time here, and I want to make sure there's plenty of time. So I'm going to go faster. All right, this gibberish is the point of, I'll skip through this really quickly, but this is effectively blue traffic, red traffic. Red traffic is from the miner to the pool, blue is the stratum response. And a couple things I want to sort of go through. This is, if you actually look at all the data that was transmitted in those packets, that packet I was showing you earlier, this is what it looks like. There's some work coming. This is all the information from the pool to the miner that says, hey, here's all the various components of the Merkle tree that you need to actually build, so you can actually build valid headers to mine against. And you can see that it's not submitting any shares, and so there's some difficulty adjustments. It starts at 65. Down here, the pool actually adjusts us down to 32. And I think even on the next one, it goes down to 81K or 8K as the difficulty. And you can see now that we start to submit some shares, you can see that it jacks up our difficulty to 16K so that we're not sending so many shares. And the thing that I really want to point out is the plain text. This is your worker name, or your account. It's actually your account name. When I was swapping that, and that's the worker ID S17. That machine is probably dead at this point, if you get that joke. But the whole point is Stratum is very insecure in that it's a plain text protocol. Guaranteed your ISP can see every bit of what's happening here. Now, that's not to say they're evil and they're going to go snatch it. All right, so here's 2 quick attack examples. This is what I'm sort of calling the DNS poisoning example. For argument's sake, your router is acting as, or your firewall router is acting as your DNS server. Several years ago, there was a universal plug-and-play vulnerability that effectively was in the firmware, the OEM firmware for basically every home router on the planet, which effectively allowed an attacker who could scan your IP, figure you out, and actually configure your router to allow them access with this universal plug-and-play vulnerability. So for argument's sake, that happens, and they actually compromised your DNS server. And so now they're effectively acting as your DNS server, and you don't even know about it. So now he's asked for his DNS request, and he gets a different IP than the 5225, whatever that other IP was. And like I said before, he has no idea who it's actually talking to. It just knows the IP that it was told. And so now you're just talking to this malicious pool, and you're making a whole lot of money for someone else. If you've ever seen the AmpBleed, the mining pool, or the wallet that the AmpBleed mines to, it's got several $100 million worth of Bitcoin because it's so easy for this to happen. Now, it's not necessarily DNS poisoning. It's actually compromised at the miner itself. But as an example, it's extremely easy. Here's a little bit more complicated one. For argument's sake, we got a miner who actually got into our network or somehow got into our routing stream. And again, because we don't know who we're talking to, and actually in this case, this is more of a TCP level attack, it could in fact even have gotten the correct IP address from DNS. So in this case, it didn't compromise DNS, but because they were able to get in line, now there's several different ways that could happen. You can change, you could get in the network, you could change the default gateway of the miners, so it's sending its packets through a different stream, or someone could actually just get in there and man in the middle it physically. Or it could be even outside in your ISP. And so the TCP connection now actually gets jumped by the attacker. And now, so TCP, I said, is reliable. It also has some validation. So you can't just change the data in line and let it talk to the original pool, but they can easily actually say, oh, hey, I'm just going to intercept this packet, and I'm going to be your TCP connection party, your TCP friend, and then it basically takes the information that S17, whatever, account name, worker name, and it can literally just replace it and send it off to its own pool, or just have its own pool and actually register whatever the same username you had at the other pool. And so there's an extremely easy way because Stratum is so insecure being just completely plain text. So I do think from a Stratum v2 perspective, that's, I think, probably the single biggest benefit to Stratum v2 is that it's actually encrypted end-to-end and makes a lot of these sorts of attacks a little bit more difficult. It doesn't actually solve the DNS poisoning attack, but it does actually solve the man-in-the-middle attack. So anyways, all right, so that's, I think that's pretty much it. And I think I'm definitely bumping up on time, but like I said, my goal was hopefully a couple of you guys walk away with a few tips you can go home and do, or at least know to hit me up and ask me questions. Either now or the rest of today or Telegram or whatever. So really appreciate y'all's time and engagement.